music. So my issue was just, who do I invite, and how do I get this discussion going, and how am I going to get other people who are not talking about these issues to listen to the people who are and be interested and motivated. So I wanted to have it here. It's going to be up on Penn Sound. It's going to be on YouTube. I'm going to try to disperse it as widely as possible so that the ideas can be sort of put out there. Without further ado, I would like for Jennifer to sort of talk about the practical issues of talking about this with students, and then.
Well, I have, two kind of personal anecdotes. One that Amy references. I teach within the academy for a living, and I do just try to teach a lot of different types of poets, people who I'm interested in, people who don't match my aesthetics, so my students just get a really broad range. And I also, a little bit of an agenda, I see who is not being taught, and I try to make those people, put those people on my syllabus. And it's pretty easy to figure that out. You just look at what faculty syllabi, and you bring up names, and you get looks like, huh, who is that? So I do this, and I teach it in pretty majority white, all-white classroom for the most part, which is my first time teaching in that kind of environment. And what happens is when I teach people, poets of color, I find that there's this silence always. And these are classes where students always have something to say. They're really like right in there. And then soon, not always, but soon it seems like there's a pattern that every time I'm bringing in a poet of color, there's a silence. And I've actually, students have come to me afterwards, or I've engaged students and asked, like, what's going on? And I want to know, how do I address the space? Because it seems like a great space for potential, like for me to do something and take responsibility there. And, I have some students of color who say, like, look, I don't want to come and speak for this poet of color and say, oh, this is how you should read it, or, it's not my job. And then someone saying, by the way, I hate this poetry. Like, I don't like that poet, so why should I, have that pressure? And then I have some white students who say to me, well, I feel really nervous, like I'm not entitled to have a conversation about this poet's work. So it's like the silence on both sides. There's times where I have addressed the silence on the spot, and it's been somewhat successful, or it's just created more silence. So, I'm just kind of positing it as a question. I'm at this point where I don't know. If I can just say one other personal anecdote that was sort of enlightening to me, also involved within the academy. Last spring, I was asked to be on a committee to come up with like great books for the school. That's going to be a core class. So that's another issue in itself why I was asked, and I asked myself that question a lot. But I went to the first couple meetings, and these people were talking and sending emails after the meetings of name dropping. You should read this. You should read that. Not one African American writer was put on the list in the beginning, and just. I have to admit, I was silent in the beginning because I was like, what is going on? I was totally in shock. I thought, this is the stuff going on when I was in college. And it just, maybe this shows my naivete, but it was meaningful to me. What I did was I went home and I crafted this email through all these emails from the community members saying, where are our writers of color, and where are the African American novelists and poets? I don't see any on the list. Can we address this absence? What's going on? Lo and behold, all the conversation stopped. I was getting I was looking at my emails every day going, don't these people have something better to do? That's how many emails I was getting about the topic. And then I said this, and it stopped. And the one person who did respond was the one African American colleague of mine who said, I'm so glad you said something, because I was working up my energy to have that talk with them, and I didn't want to do it. But it was just, it was just a completely enlightening, horrifying experience.
So the catch is, where does somebody white is reading non-white literature or whatever, the poetics, where does the appropriation come in and the silence meet? I'll just pose another really open question, but anyone should feel free. I sent this to everybody. Reginald Shepard. Poetry presents the possibility of an otherness that is liberating rather than constricting. It offers the prospect of an alienation from alienation. As I have written too often, minority writers are expected and expect themselves to be spokespeople for whatever, a reified version of whatever identity they have claimed or been assigned, and their work is judged almost wholly in those terms. That's from Reginald Shepard's blog post against identity poetry for possibility. So my question is, does poetry truly offer space for people to surpass the limitations of societal, cultural, or sociological labels? What do those kinds of poetries, those with the prospect of an alienation from alienation, both any person then offer, and what can be worked through in those poetries? Any ideas?
Well, I'd like to speak to that a little bit. I mean, Reginald, as most of you know, died 2.5 weeks ago, and he had an obsession with race and the homoerotics of race. So if you read his books, in every book, poem after poem, you literally read the words black and white, right? I mean, it was an obsession. He had this wonderful essay in I think it was 2 issues ago, Conjunctions did a sort of issue on desire, and Reginald's piece in there was all about the intersection of race and self-hatred, and this whole questioning of why he was turned on by white guys. And so for me, race is a germane issue to writing, and as a reader, if race is like a demon, you know, if it's the thing that really keeps them up late at night, then I can see that when I read the writing. But to me, as a reader and a writer, race in and of itself is not very interesting per se, because what I'm interested in is what is the obsession of a writer, and then what's the art that translates that obsession. And if it captures my attention, it doesn't matter if I share an identity position with them or not, because I can see an obsession. Now, I live in Washington Heights, so on my street, when I walk out the front door, it's all Russian Jews. When I look out my back window, it's the Dominican community. So every day when I'm walking around, people are walking their dogs. And I often look at their dogs and I think, these dogs don't know the difference between a Russian Jew and a Dominican or a Chinese American or a white person.
Are you sure?
I think, well, I actually thought about that. Am I sure? And I think visually, of course, they can pick up difference, right? But I think it seems like to me a dog is more interested in breed, like we're a human breed, and there's a cat and there's another dog, right? I mean, I might be wrong, but seriously, when I go, we just got 2 cats from the Humane Society in Kingston, and I don't know, but I just get the impression that those cats are not racist, right? They're just more going on breed. And so I'm bringing up this story because when I meet someone who says that they're a poet, the part of my tail that starts wagging is like the poet tail. You see, and race is really secondary. It's like if that's their obsession, if they're pissed off because the poetics listserv is not talking enough about race or whatever, I'll listen. I mean, if that's their issue. But for me, I remember I was on the poetics listserv for 10 years, and I finally just I didn't have my name removed. I just sort of died. You know, because I wasn't responding anymore, and so my not participating in that conversation was more like the poetics discussions weren't that engaging to me, even though I like gossip. I think that's why I stayed on for so long. I was just kind of curious what people were bitching about, right? But, so there's so much of it, for me, that race doesn't enter the picture, and I'll end with a short anecdote, which is, you know, 20 years ago when I started writing poetry, and I was seeking out all sorts of people to work with, like Mark Strand, Charles Simic, and Donald Justice was one of my teachers. And he once sat me down and said, Tim, you know, you have so much to write about because you're gay, you're Mormon, and you're Asian. Just take your pick, you know, and just run with it. And even at the time when he said that, I thought it was a little bit insulting, right? But at the same point, I also was kind of curious what he's talking about. And one of his former mentees was the poet Marilyn Chin, and so he kind of brought up, do you know Marilyn's work, blah, blah, blah. Now, ultimately for me, in all